I'm Leslie Griffin, and my colleague Ursula and I would like to welcome everyone to our final Women in World Trade New England program of 2020. No doubt, because of the reputation of our speaker, Wendy Cutler, we have a broad group joining us today, including a number from outside of our membership. And so for those of you who learned about this event in some way other than an email from me, that means you aren't in our database. And if you would like to be, so you'll be informed of upcoming events, just reply to the email that I sent yesterday with the Zoom details, and we'll be happy to get you added. For those who don't know, Women in World Trade New England is actually a revival of a group that first started in 1987, but for various reasons had gone dormant by the early 2000s. It was literally 1 year ago tonight that a group of us got together at Carrie Nation on Beacon Hill in Boston to talk about the idea of reviving it. One in-person event and 5 virtual events later, we come to the end of our first year. Ursula and I want to thank everyone who joined our programs and helped us build a sense of community in a difficult year. And I'd like to particularly thank Emily Westhoven, the Executive Director of the German American Business Council of Boston, who has kindly let us use her platform for all of our virtual programming this year and recorded the programs for us. This program will be available on our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel shortly after the program. So without further ado, let's get started. I would like to turn it over to a very supportive member of our community, Betty Robson. Betty is president and principal of JF Moran, a certified woman-owned worldwide logistics services company, and is also an associate professor of business at Johnson & Wales University in Rhode Island. So Betty, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. This is going to be a great way to spend our lunch hour, and I am so thrilled to introduce Wendy Cutler. She is the VP and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Wendy develops leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade and investment, as well as women's empowerment in Asia. She joined ASPI following an illustrious career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Most recently, she served as Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, working on a range of U.S. trade negotiations and initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region. In that capacity, she was responsible for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, including the bilateral negotiations with Japan. She also was the chief negotiator to the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. We are so fortunate to have Wendy joining us today, so I thank her for being here with us. To get us started, I think we need to acknowledge that our audience is very diverse with different backgrounds and understandings about trade and trade policy. So I think it would be really helpful, Wendy, if you could help us all understand just a little bit more about this election transition.
Well, first, thanks so much for inviting me to join you. Leslie Griffin and I go way back. She probably doesn't remember, but I try to hire her at least once, if not twice, during her years in Washington, but she always found better opportunities because she was in such great demand. So we miss her in Washington, but you're really fortunate to have her. And last week when we were doing a pre-meeting, I got to talk more with Ursula and Betty. And if the rest of the group is like you three, then this is an incredible group. And I think we'll have a really good and fun conversation over the next year. So as Betty mentioned, I worked for over 30 years with the US government on trade. I'd like to say I started when I was in elementary school, but I don't think you'll believe me. But I did start at a relatively young age. And in terms of my career path, I was never one to think I was going to spend most of my career with the US government. But I became a trade negotiator, and frankly, it was such a fun job. I kept getting promoted and working with different countries and different political appointees, both from the Republican and the Democratic Party through the years, and really ended up staying until it got to the point where, let's just say, my retirement was basically I was working for close to nothing and working like 20 hours a day. So financially, it just didn't make any sense. And also, I felt like I had kind of achieved what I wanted to in the public domain. And now I'm with a think tank. It's part of the Asia Society. So it's great to join you and a lot of topics to discuss. So during my 28 years at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, I worked during 4 transitions. First from Bush 1 to Clinton, then back to Bush, then to Obama, and I'm not sure if I forgot something in between. But anyway, a number of transitions, and like any, when transitions are about change, and there's change in personalities and there's change in policies. Now, up until the Trump administration, trade policy was pretty steady between the Republicans and the Democrats, both focused on market opening, wanted to work cooperatively with our allies and partners and in the World Trade Organization. There was different emphasis on issues or regions. The Republicans always seemed to be more focused on working on Latin America. The Democrats, for whatever reason, more interested in working in Asia. And the Democrats much more interested in the issues of labor and the environment. The Republicans perhaps more interested in the issue of IPR. But for the most part, the policies were pretty steady. And so when we went through transitions, it was more kind of the personality side that I think produced the most angst among people like me, who are called kind of career civil servants, right? Because we stayed. And transitions, like in any job, are, since they're about change, they're not fun. And generally what happens in a transition is that, well, first, let's just talk about the lame duck period, what we're going through now. After the election, once the president-elect is selected, then he or her typically then starts, sets up transition teams for each different government agency. And these teams basically have kind of 2 charges. One is to really look at issues like personnel and budget and try and figure out what's going on in that agency that they need to bring to the attention of the White House. And second, they focus on what are the key decision points that are going to come up quickly, like in the first 100 days and maybe in the first 6 months in that issue area for the next administration. And so that's exactly what these transition teams are doing now that they've been allowed into the various government agencies. And they will produce reports, I think, somewhere between 10 and 20 people on each transition team, depending on how big the agency is. Some of the representatives from the private sector, some are from think tanks, generally some former officials who worked in that agency. So their work is underway now and will be completed by the time of the inauguration. And then, the leader, the cabinet secretary, would be selected and needs to be confirmed by Congress. In some cases that will happen by January 21, in other cases it won't. But once the new cabinet head comes, they don't come with their whole staff. And generally it takes anywhere between 6 months and a year to kind of fill out the rest of the positions. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, pretty small agency by government standards, around 250 people, and generally somewhere around 25 political appointees. So that seems, that's pretty small. And so there is that period of time, and generally in most administrations, it takes somewhere between 6 months and a year for both sides to kind of, the career people and the political people of the new team, to kind of trust each other, learn how to work with each other. And frankly, it generally requires some major adjustments on the career side. I mean, I've worked for some U.S. trade representatives who basically want everything on paper, okay? So they want detailed memos every day about this or that. I've worked for other USTRs not interested in paper. They want to have meetings. So then you're in meetings all the time. But it's kind of like exactly what you all probably go through with your bosses as well. But it is a time of change, and it is a time of angst. And the other kind of thing I would just bring to the forefront it really varies, you know, administration to administration. And, you know, and a lot of it is dependent on personalities. And so, you know, you can't say the Republicans this or the Democrats that. It really just depends on the personality of the person coming in. Do they have a trade background? If they don't, you know, what strengths do they bring to the job? I worked for Mickey Cantor, for example, who was Clinton's campaign director. He had no trade background and was kind of thrust into this job. But then I've worked for someone like Susan Schwab, who knew trade better than, frankly, all the rest of us in the building. So her needs were very different. So again, it just depends, you know, administration to administration and kind of USTR to USTR.
So this is also interesting. I can see people leaning forward. And so I just want to, before I ask my question, if you guys have questions in the audience, please put them in the chat, and we're going to try to reserve 10 minutes or so at the end to answer some of these, because Wendy, you're just generating a lot of interest here because we all want to be in the know. But do you think that the transition that's taking place right now is as smooth as they have been in the past, or do you think that some of the uncertainty that still exists might be affecting it?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, if any transition wasn't smooth, it was probably Trump's transition, because as we all know, he didn't think he would win. And so he really didn't have a strong team working during his campaign, thinking of who he'd put in these positions, right? So it was kind of last minute for him. And as a result, a lot of his cabinet appointees weren't properly vetted, meaning they either had financial problems or conflicts of interest. And it's hard to think back 4 years, but a number of them were not confirmed that their names needed to be withdrawn once you know, their backgrounds were looked into. The vetting process is like extremely important, and typically, at least that begins during a campaign. So you're checking what people say on social media. You're just getting a sense of, you know, what they did in their previous positions in the private sector, for example. But the, you know, the actual documents that need to be submitted, that all happens once you're actually, you know, once you're nominated. So in this regard, I think the Biden team has just been very organized. They know how to do a transition. Biden is a creature of Washington, having worked in Congress and worked in confirmations in the past from the Senate side, and then also being vice president for 8 years and putting together his own staff in the vice president's office. Where it was unsmooth in the beginning is basically getting certification, for lack of a better word, from the General Services Administration, because the GSA basically needs to give the green light to the president-elect and his transition team to get office space, to get access to funding and access to classified information. That took a few weeks to happen, but it has happened. And my understanding is the transition's, you know, going as well as can be. There have been some, you know, problems that have surfaced in the press with respect to certain agencies, but it seems to be going smoothly. And again, I think the Biden team was like really prepared for this. And one way you can tell is how quickly he's nominating, you know, cabinet officials for the whole, you know, the whole slew of the cabinet. And he's made some very important decisions already.
So I know that you don't have a crystal ball, but I imagine that you probably have a good sense of what the first 100 days of the new administration might look like in terms of setting up trade and trade policy. Can you share any insight that you have with us?
Yeah, and you know, you're probably aware that unlike Trump, where basically his trade policy to a large extent was his foreign policy, trade is not going to play that front and center role in a Biden administration like it did in the Trump administration. And the president-elect has been very clear that he's going to put priority on COVID recovery, economic recovery, and building U.S. competitiveness with respect to education, infrastructure, innovation, worker training, before he's planning to enter into new trade agreements. And so I think, you know, he would like to put trade on the back burner. But what I've been saying, and I'm not the only one, is just a couple of things. Number one, he's also putting emphasis on working with allies and partners and taking a multilateral approach, not only to trade, but basically to U.S. foreign policy more generally. And I think what he's going to experience is once you start talking to allies and partners, guess what? A lot of them have trade issues on their mind. So they're going to put trade on his plate. And second, there are a number of things, decisions, as well as tariffs and export controls and other sanctions that I need to call him the president-elect and not the vice president, so excuse me, that he's going to inherit from the Trump administration. And frankly, I don't think we've even seen the end of what is going to be done by the Trump administration, because every week now, particularly with respect to China, they're announcing more sanctions. They're putting more Chinese entities on the so-called entity list. They're expanding export controls. They're taking more measures with respect to human rights violations. And I think a lot of this is in an effort to kind of lock in these measures so they'll be tough for the president-elect and his team to unwind if they choose to do so.
So I was going to ask you how they prioritize, but it sounds as though it might be the priorities might arise and they become reactive. Is that am I reading that right?
Yeah, I know to some degree. And again, I think the transition team will come in and they'll have like the whole list of what, and they'll divide it. For example, there's some congressionally mandated reports that USTR does that will need to be done within the first 100 days. So number two, there are some actions and like trade investigations, for example, against Vietnam and Europe that are in train. And it's unclear if indeed Trump will act on these investigations or he'll just leave that decision for, the Biden administration. There's also the possibility that that he will hand over to a Biden administration the UK-U.S. negotiation if indeed more progress is made, and then the Biden team will have to decide, do we go forward with this because we're going to need a congressional vote, or do we kind of put it on hold and tell the Brits we need more time? And that decision will largely, I think, depend on how far the current team gets with the UK between now and January 20th. So, there will be those type of decisions. And frankly, a lot of people will want the new team to take decisions, including the career staff. And, I heard a number of times I'd go down with the new team, down to their office, and I'd say, look, this is urgent. We need to take a decision. And they look at me like, well, what happens if we wait 6 months or we put it lower on the queue? And I try and make the argument that the other country, may respond this way or that way. And then they'll just decide, what, we're not going to focus on this right now. So again, I think the challenge though, and I think Betty, you kind of put your finger on it, you don't want to be just reactive and defensive, because 4 years goes by really quickly, even though sometimes a week in the Trump administration felt like 40 years. It's not a long time to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So the challenge is to really keep your eye on the ball of your objectives going forward and not getting derailed by, one fire after another fire. And that's frankly easier said than done, but it's critical if you're going to make a mark and have a legacy and really shape the country in the way you promise the vote.
And how much of that being able to shape policy and shape the country in the way that you promised is dependent on the congressional election?
A lot is. I mean, we've seen under President Trump, a lot can be done through executive order, but we've also seen that you need Congress to approve, budgets and legislation in the various areas. And so for trade in particular, if you want to go ahead with a big trade negotiation, you need Congress to approve that agreement. And what's happening in trade, which is just fascinating for someone like me who's worked in this area forever, is that we used to be able to rely on the Republicans as being really pro-business, and they would kind of be the coalition that would vote for all of these trade agreements. Well, that's kind of changed with Trump, and the Republican Party is undergoing kind of a metamorphosis with respect to trade. On the other hand, the Democrats, you have the progressive Democrats who have their definite views on trade and tend to probably have more in common with a lot of the right-wing Republicans than the moderates in the Democratic Party. But I think putting together coalitions to vote on trade agreements, all the math that's been used for the past 20, 30 years, I don't think it's going to stick anymore, particularly if President Trump is planning to run in 4 years and he's going to continuing to tweet and kind of keep the pressure on Republicans. Trade is an issue where, Trump, let's just say he feels strongly about. He is one of the issues where, 20, 30 years ago, he was saying the same things that he was saying and doing over the past 4 years. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to watch the politics of trade going forward. I would just say the latest polling suggests that Democrats are more free trade than Republicans. Like, for me, my head is spinning because I never thought I would see that. Now, some pollsters will tell you that, frankly, that some of that might have to do with Democrats just being against anything Trump was for. So you really need to see where that poll would be a year from now. But I think it really shows kind of the different coalitions and different views on trade, whether it be by education or generation or by party. But there's a lot of shifts going on in among the U.S. population now on trade.
So that raises a good point, because one of the questions I had is, how much attention do you think will be focused on keeping the industrial heartland happy, right? Particularly after the results of the election?
And that's a great question. And let's keep in mind that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, now I'm forgetting the third, really kind of determine the outcome of the election. And so it's going to be very critical. The White House will keep a very close eye on those communities. And as the industrial heartland, I don't want to say they're going to want to be protectionist, but I think that a lot of attention will need to be paid to them. These states, they have farmers and a lot of manufacturers, and that's going to complicate. For example, President-elect Biden says he wants to really reset our relationship with the European Union. Well, guess what? One of the first things the European Union is going to ask for is for the U.S. to lift its tariffs on steel and aluminum. But that's not going to be easy for the president-elect to do, because the steel workers supported him, and they're prevalent. I'm sorry, it's Pennsylvania instead of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He needs to be very cognizant. So I think there will be political constraints, which might lead to kind of a less market opening trade policy than we might have expected. But I also remind people, Biden was kind of a traditional Democrat when it came to trade. And when you look at his voting record on free trade agreements when he was in the Senate, he voted for the Australia FTA, the Morocco FTA. He voted for PNTR, tariff treatment with China, and the initial NAFTA. But he voted against all of the other FTAs or abstained. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind too. He has been more of a pro-labor kind of traditional Democrat when it comes to trade.
That's interesting. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask at the Women in World Trade event, what role will a woman vice president play in trade?
It's unclear. Kamala Harris, she wasn't brought, unlike, other potential selections like a Susan Rice, she's not that experienced on the foreign scene. And so it's unclear the role that the president will assign her, which issues, and whether she takes over some trade or international issues remains to be seen. He's got a very deep bench in the foreign policy area, and we've seen that with Jake Sullivan, who will be his national security advisor, Tony Blinken, who will be the Secretary of State. Avril Haines, who's going to be the head of the Director for National Intelligence. We got very close to having a woman selected as the Defense Secretary, but Michelle Flournoy was apparently overtaken by a former general who was nominated for that position. But, let's just be honest, there's a lot of emphasis on diversity in this cabinet. So I think we're going to see a lot of women also in the remaining, selected for the remaining cabinet positions, including perhaps for USTR and Commerce. And, then remember, even once the cabinet secretaries are announced, you're going to have undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries. So I think we're going to see, a very robust presence of women in this cabinet. And in the trade field, just to be honest, all my years at USTR, I worked for 9 USTRs, 3 were women. And there were just a lot of, there are a lot of women in this field. And so I'm pretty, bullish about the presence of women, not only in trade, but just in the international realm as well, in terms of the Biden cabinet.
Looking forward to see how that
yeah, lots of rumors, lots of rumors. And there's something called the echo chamber in Washington, because there are people who are promoting themselves. And so they get their name in the press, then other people start talking about them. And sometimes, like, the administration to be, they're not even thinking of this person. So, you need to sift through all of this stuff, but it is amazing how, how that echo chamber just, perpetuates. And I tell people, there's some names out there who might be USTR or the Commerce Secretary, but just be prepared for someone, unexpected. And one of the things I tell people to just keep in mind that, to the extent that, certain people were kind of promised a position, did a lot of work, highly qualified, had been with Biden for many, many years, but for whatever reason didn't get, weren't nominated for certain positions towards the end. And that's where the USTR typically is selected. Sometimes it's just someone, who was passed over for a different position. And I worked for Mickey Cantor, for example, and he's someone, again, from the Clinton campaign, ran the Clinton campaign, was supposed to get a different position, didn't get one. USTR, one of the last positions filled, and they put him there. And the rumors were completely different. And we were all saying, who? Mickey Cantor, he doesn't know trade. But he turned out, frankly, to be one of the best USTRs that I worked for.
I know we want to move on to trade-specific policies with Asia, but I've got to ask, while we're still talking about the transition, do you think it's possible to go back to the more traditional closed doors way of developing trade policy after 4 years of policy by tweet, right? Has the cover been ripped open?
Yeah, and I can just tell you as a trade negotiator, I would read some of those tweets and my heart would go out to my former colleagues who are sitting in negotiating rooms with their colleagues, because the unpredictability of the president and, he kind of thrived on that. And I'll be the first to admit, if you're in a negotiating room, you don't want to be totally predictable. You don't want the other side to be able to read your every move. So some degree of unpredictability is useful. But when when there is a threshold where it becomes counterproductive, and I can just tell you as a negotiator, the worst thing that can happen to you is to be in a room with another country. You're representing the United States. You have a cleared position. You think you know what you're doing, only to kind of read something publicly that the president just totally either discounted what you said or came up with another policy. And that's been a real challenge. The other thing in trade negotiations, you don't want everything to be public. In fact, a lot of times that is counterproductive. There are some times when it's useful, but what I used to find with countries that I was negotiating with, the more they talked to the press, the harder it was to negotiate with them, because then the public had an expectation. And they would come in and say, well, sorry, we can't move because it's been out in the public that, we were going to get X, Y, and Z. And my response would be, yeah, but you're the ones who set up that expectation. Like, what did you think would happen? And so, you know, again, a lot of this, effective negotiations, let's just say there's a need for transparency with the domestic audience for sure. And we can get to that because that's always been a very kind of controversial issue in the trade world. But, you know, if you're going to make a deal with someone, having that trust and being able to keep things quiet and not negotiate in public, I think more times than not allows you to reach a deal. I think we're going to see, though, one, you know, just to get back to something else you said, a real traditional policy making process. And I sound like a complete bureaucrat here. You're probably already saying, wow, this is getting boring. But here's the deal, like before you announce a policy, wouldn't you want your government to have like a real thorough vetting internally of what the costs and benefits might be, how stakeholders might respond, how foreign countries may respond? And even if you decide to go forward with a policy, and I'll give you the example, let's just say of some of the tariffs against China. So when the president first went forward with the first tranche of tariffs against China to affect $34 billion worth of US imports, that was an unprecedented amount. Now we laugh at it because we've got imports on $370 billion worth of imports. But that first tranche, those numbers were way beyond any retaliation that had been taken before. And I think the Trump team really expected that China would say, oh no, what do you want us to do, and come to the negotiating table? Because the threat of those tariffs, again, would be enough to get them to move. But that didn't happen. And I think if there was like a real policy process, people like me who'd like, and you know, I'm not saying me personally, but people with my background in the policy process, we would have said, well, look, there is a chance, and probably a good chance, that China's going to counter retaliate. If they do, it's probably going to be in the agriculture sector. So we need to be ready to think about how we're going to take care of our farmers if they're going to be disproportionately hurt by these China actions. And you could do that, for example, let's just say by launching a trade negotiation with another country to open up their agriculture market. You could do that through subsidies, but this administration was totally unprepared for that. And as many of you remember, like a year later, 2 years later, they started throwing $12 billion of subsidies towards the farmers, and then more later on. But a lot of what the farmers were saying is, we don't want subsidies here. We want markets. We want to be able to sell our stuff. And so that's just kind of one example where if you have a thorough vetting of policies, you can kind of you can plan for adverse actions, but you can also tweak your policy so you won't be sued, or you won't be undermined, or you won't end up pursuing a policy that hurts your own interests more than the foreign country.
So you've raised so many important points there, and it's still begging the question, you know, with COVID being the #1 priority, you know, how important or what level of priority will the Biden administration place on trade with Asia, and specifically China?
Yeah. Look, they're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think China is going to be extremely an important lens going forward for any administration when they think of both their domestic policies and their foreign policies. And I think in particular, when in the trade area, while there may be less interest in doing, you know, embarking on all these different trade negotiations with different countries, I think there'll be early efforts to work with allies and partners on a kind of a unified front vis-a-vis China, whether it be with respect to rules and standards we want to jointly establish with them, whether it be with respect to coordinating on export controls or investment restrictions. But I think that's going to be a priority. But I don't see the administration coming in the first few months being able, you know, ready to lift tariffs or all these export controls and other sanctions put in place, as any administration will do, and this one will do for sure after these past 4 years. I think we're going to see a very detailed kind of policy review of our overall policy towards China, with trade and technology being part of that policy, but not necessarily driven by those issues as they have been under the current administration.
You know, when you talked about the subsidies and how the agricultural sector would prefer markets rather than subsidies, it makes me think about, you know, what can happen in the future with our trading partners in terms of being hit with countervailing duties later on if they can prove dumping. Do you think that that had been a consideration or will be a consideration with the new administration, you know, trying to open markets rather than giving subsidies?
I do, but you know, let's just be honest. These market opening agreements are just very, you know, let's just say they're controversial in the United States. There are certain states and industries that are very pro free and fair trade that really want access to markets. And frankly, you know, most of the agricultural sector fits in here because they really rely on markets. A lot of our manufacturing companies are torn. Some are very export oriented, some aren't. Services probably be more export oriented. But you know, we need to put on the table though that, you know, we're in a recession now due to COVID. And in any kind of economic recession, you know, trade becomes less and less popular, frankly. And there's more of a focus on an inward focus. And so, again, I think it's just critical for the incoming administration to focus on these domestic issues and not just recovery to get us back where we were, but also, again, to make us more competitive. Because when you look at the money that China is pouring into its economy and its, you know, the development of technologies into R&D, we are falling behind. We're very innovative. We have a lot of strengths. We can be very competitive, but frankly, you know, there's a lot of stuff we need to be doing domestically. And my view is if we do that well, then trade won't be as controversial.
So what do you think the future is going forward with trade with Asia in terms of, you know, will we revisit the TPP? You know, will we start to consider how that can affect us going forward and help us to grow?
Yeah. So, you know, the TPP was an agreement started during the Bush administration, signed during the Obama administration. I worked on it for many years, and it involved 11 other Asia Pacific countries, including Japan, Canada, Mexico, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and others. And President Trump, during his first week in office, withdrew the United States from that deal. And it's fascinating to me because once we withdrew, our other trading partners, they didn't really get it. Like, they're like, what? Like, you know, basically you made us kind of live up to agree to your standards and make all these politically difficult decisions about opening our market, improving our intellectual property protection, and living up to the labor and environment demands you made. And, you know, they didn't get it, but then they kind of lost interest in the agreement, at least initially, because they thought with the U.S. out, this agreement doesn't make any sense. Well, within a few months, they kind of changed their minds and they decided, you know what, let's give it a try. Let's try and do this without the United States. And they did succeed. And a year or so later, they put the agreement into effect. So now the question is, would the United States be interested in returning to this agreement? And now it's not our agreement, it's an agreement among 11 other countries. And so it's not like we would be starting a new negotiation. We would be asking existing members, you know, can we join your party? And part of the study I did, I surveyed a lot of current and former TPP officials. And on one hand, they were like, yes, we would love the United States to come back into this agreement. But, and the big but was, while we know you need to make some changes to the agreement, we're not prepared to kind of, you know, to make, you know, major changes like, we would want you to be very kind of targeted in the requests and for changes you've made. But it's really not clear whether the Biden administration would be interested in returning to this deal. There are a lot of compelling reasons to do so. But again, this agreement in particular is very controversial domestically, particularly among the progressives. And so I think probably, at least in the immediate term, a more realistic path would be for the Biden team to pursue narrower sectoral deals in the Asia Pacific, perhaps on digital trade or on climate and trade or on medical supplies and trade, but something narrower, which could be negotiated quicker, could be put into, into effect sooner, so the impact could be felt. Probably would not need congressional approval. It would depend on the content. And, I think it could go a long way in rebuilding trust and repairing our relationships and show this important region that we're back in the game economically, because we're really being sidelined in the Asia market right now. China is the #1 trading partner for almost all countries in Asia, if not the world. We're becoming, let's just say, more and more on the outside looking into these trade agreements and not getting those benefits, which by definition make US exports less competitive vis-a-vis the products of foreign competitors.
So I'll refrain from referring to it as fast track, but with the TPA expiring in May of 2021, how is that going to impact our ability to negotiate new agreements?
Yeah. So Trade Promotion Authority is the authority Congress gives the executive branch to negotiate trade agreements. It includes consultation provisions. It includes, like, Congress outlines the objectives it wants to see accomplished in any trade agreement. And then it basically says, if you follow all these procedures, we will vote on this agreement either yes or no without making amendments. And so this is an important vehicle for the executive branch. Once they negotiate a deal, the last thing they want is to go to Congress and then have to go back to the trading partners and ask for renegotiation. This legislation has been now in effect for 6 years. It's going to expire July 1. So this is one of those early decisions a Biden team would need to take. My sense is I don't see the Biden administration placing priority on trying to get this legislation through. Again, a lot on their plate domestically. They have a lot of other legislative priorities. Trade votes require a lot of work. They're not fun. They're controversial. And a trade vote for kind of procedures for negotiating trade agreements is even like, it's amorphous, right? And you don't have companies coming in and being able to say to their member, well, as a result of this agreement, we're going to get, all these new export opportunities and hire more workers. To make the case for Trade Promotion Authority, it's a very kind of theoretical type of discussion. So I think it's going to lapse, and I think that will affect our ability to negotiate trade agreements with other countries. Other countries like us to have that authority, because the last thing they want is to negotiate with us, the executive branch, and then have Congress come back and say, guess what, we need X more on dairy products, or we need, lower tariffs on widgets, and then ask us to renegotiate. Some of that goes on already, in fairness, but this legislation is still important. I think, maybe what we're more likely to see going forward is limited TPA for a specific negotiation. But the notion of having a big TPA bill in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, I don't see it.
That will be very interesting to watch. So in our last few minutes before we go into the question section, as women in world trade, we're so interested in hearing about your experience as a woman in negotiation. And if you can, give us a little insight as to what makes a good negotiator, and, whether or not there are advantages or disadvantages that women run into in negotiation, that would be great.
Yeah. So like a lot of my career, I negotiated with guys, right? So I negotiated trade agreements a lot with Japan, Korea, China, and others. And I often found myself kind of like the only woman at the negotiating table. Clearly, once it's changing a bit now, but for the most part, you would look across the table and it would be all men. On our side, obviously, other women were with me. And, it's just interesting through the years, when I was inexperienced, I think a lot of my counterparts from other countries tried to test me. I always thought that maybe, particularly the Japanese, I thought they had some kind of bet going on among all of them to see who could make me cry, the quickest. A lot of tricks were going on. And, what I tell young female negotiators is just really important to be very steady, not be emotional, and not let them get to you. And it's hard because I think as women, we tend to personalize a lot of this stuff. And I remember one of my early negotiations sitting across the table from a counterpart, and frankly, he was pretty insulting towards me, right? Like if you were more prepared, Miss Cutler, you could do a better job, or if your team was blah, 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 blah. And after all of this, he came up to me later and he was like, okay, so where are we meeting for dinner? Like it was like nothing had happened. And I'm thinking, as he's saying all this to me, I'm never going to even though he plans for dinner tonight, I'm not going out with him. But it really was useful for me because it showed he wasn't personalizing any of this. This was just all negotiating tactics to kind of make me uneasy, to get under my skin. And probably his hope is therefore I'd be kind of more conciliatory. So there were a lot of lessons like that, you learn through the years. I never got formal, negotiating training. Basically, for a number of years, I just watched other negotiators, good ones and bad ones. And frankly, I learned through, my mistakes. I'll say even towards the end, when I thought I was a pretty good negotiator by the time I left and really experienced, I would still kind of every night would kind of go through the discussion during the day in my head. And I would slap myself thinking like, gosh, well, how did you let him get away with saying that? You should have responded this way, or you should have just let him keep talking and not made it easy for him, or you should have waited 3 days from now. So you're always second guessing yourself, right? You never get the perfect score. But there are a lot of attributes and things that you can do to make yourself more effective. And I put these attributes forward and I'll give you some examples. And I don't think it's limited to like government to government trade negotiations. Some of these are kind of ways you should just interact with people at the workplace or just more generally in your life. Number one, I think like listening is extremely important. And particularly internationally, I think Americans, we tend, when we get to these international negotiating tables, we love to talk and we're not great at listening. And for the other side, it makes them feel like that you're taking their views into consideration, and it really kind of shows them that you're according them respect. And I always found that very useful. And some of the new political appointees I work for, I would need to kind of tell them very gently that they were just talking too much. The other trick for me was that the less you said sometimes, the more the other side would talk. And sometimes they get kind of nervous if we weren't talking all the time. And they would start saying things that kind of gave me insights to what was important to them and what wasn't important to them. So listening is important. Problem solving is important. I mean, I've seen negotiators who just keep repeating their position over and over again. And sometimes that is a good tactic. But at some point, if you want a deal, you need to be thinking of how you're going to find that landing zone or some kind of middle ground. And, always in my head, I would be thinking, when I'm ready to make the deal, maybe this makes sense. So I think that's extremely important. For women, I always would tell the women working for me, probably one of the most important things is just to be well prepared, that the men will test you. And so you really need to kind of go beyond the call of duty to show that you know your stuff. And in a trade negotiation, that just doesn't mean you know your proposal or the subject matter. You need to anticipate what they might ask you or the holes that they might try to poke into the arguments you're making. You need to have a better understanding. When is their next election? What are the politics my counterpart is facing? How long is he going to be in this position? How long has he been in this position? What's his interest in making a deal? So just a lot of, you just need to be on top of your game. And I think, again, for women, just because I think we get tested, it just becomes more and more important. And then, I mean, there are a lot of other attributes, but I'd say the other thing is just to be resilient. This is a profession where there are just so many ups and downs. And, you're walking out of rooms, they're walking out of rooms. You never want to see these people ever again, but you can't break up with them like you can with a boyfriend. Kind of like sometimes your boss is like, you need to find a way to get back to the table. Like you're like tied to them. And so there's all those dynamics going on as well. And, they can be challenging. And sometimes, the down moments can get you really down. And sometimes in negotiations, you don't talk, you don't meet for 3 months because the other side has put forward like their 4 conditions for meeting, and so you're negotiating kind of, not even the substance, you're negotiating the terms for re-engagement, right? And I've been in those discussions and, sometimes they get crazy where, they want to, make sure that, certain things you're going to say or not say, or, just crazy stuff. So I think that's important. And finally, I would just say patience, because these negotiations typically can go on for years. Sometimes they're quicker, but more often than not, they go on for a long time. And you find yourself like in these negotiating rooms and that week nothing's going to happen, but you need to be there. And what I always would tell the people working for me is that when a negotiation is going to come together and you're going to make the final deal, you're going to be glad you were in those rooms for all those other negotiating rounds, because it helps you prepare for what that final package should look like.
Thank you so much. I mean, we really just got an extra bonus session of a masterclass in negotiating. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to the chat box for now and pose a few questions to you from our audience members. So one of them has asked if you could provide any thoughts on changes in international patent policy.
Yeah, I'm not the one to ask on that. I mean, I think the importance of intellectual property protection just more generally and enforcement is, just an extremely important aspect of our trade policy. And so I sense that going forward, not only with China, but other countries too, we're going to be pushing them, continue to push them, because our edge is in innovation. One thing I would say is that what I find fascinating with as negotiating on IPR issues is that that countries, they all get to the point where they hate in the beginning when they're copying more and stealing our patents and stealing and violating our copyrights, right? They hate us as trade negotiators, forcing them to do all this stuff. But then they generally get to the threshold where they have innovative companies, and all of a sudden IPR protection and enforcement for their own reasons vis-a-vis their own companies become important. And that's kind of when negotiations become, I think, fun and more productive, is when what you're asking the other country to do, they recognize is in their own interest, and therefore have their own domestic reasons and objectives for working constructively with you. And I've been in both types of negotiations, and you generally get a much better and enduring deal when the other side views it as win-win and they see the benefits that they're getting out of the deal. And frankly, you're seeing that with China now. I mean, China's got a long way to go on IPR protection and enforcement, but they've certainly been making a lot of inroads in recent years. And it's not because, overwhelmingly because the U.S. has been pressuring them. It's more because they have their own innovative companies and they have their own needs to protect, that innovation.
Thank you. Another question, with Biden indicating that he intends to re-enter the JCPOA, what do you think the outlook might be for lifting of the secondary sanctions against Iran?
Yeah, again, not the expert on this, but I do think, let's just be honest. I think one of the things that Trump is trying to do now, between now and January 20th, is make it more and more difficult for President-elect Biden and his team to re-enter the JCPOA.
We haven't touched at all upon Brexit during our discussion today. And there is a question, regarding, what happens if the UK has a hard exit from Brexit, and what's that going to do?
A negotiation going down to the wire. Wow, is this one? I mean, the stakes are so high. They've been at this for so long. Either Boris Johnson is already in Brussels or he's en route to Brussels now. Brussels is saying the deadline is, I think, tomorrow. They're going to try and reach an agreement. I just saw before I came on the air that Angela Merkel is saying that maybe they don't need a deal, that the EU is fine without a deal. So there's a lot of gamesmanship going on here. And every time I read one of these public statements, I'm always intrigued because both sides are trying to squeeze the other side, right? They're saying, oh, we're almost done. But they're always leaving a tiny window open. But if the other side really moves, then maybe we can do this. I still think there will be a Brexit deal. And as just if I had to give odds, I'd say 2/3 there will be one, 1/3 there won't be. They seem to be down to a few difficult issues. And I would just say, as a negotiator, you never want to get down to one issue, because then it's really hard to negotiate. If you have a few issues in the pot, then you have some stuff to work with. So if you do more for me here, I can do more for you there. And that's really key. And I've seen negotiators make that kind of, I call it negotiating 101 mistake, right? So right now, I think the three key issues are fishing rights, what they call level playing field, and how the competition rules will be implemented, and then kind of enforcement. And so these three issues will need to be part of the final package. The world is watching, although I have to admit, I think the world's getting a little bored and feeling, can you just, figure this out, and can we all move on?
Okay, I'm going to end with one final question because it seemed to be a theme. With the COVID travel restrictions in place and no near end in sight, do you have any insight as to when that might be, those restrictions might be lifted, was a question, but also how does that play a role in trade negotiations?
Yeah. I mean, the travel restrictions for a whole host, for people just doing business, and for, just the conducting trade has been really difficult. It's fascinating to me. I've had some, yesterday I met with some Asian visitors who came to the U.S. for meetings, government officials, one government official, one private sector official. And they were telling me, they're both Koreans, and they were telling me, like, in Korea now, it's a total crisis. They have like 500 cases in Seoul. And I just looked at them and, and all of a sudden, like, Seoul is like locking down, okay? So very different kind of perspective on COVID. They did a really good job. But what we are seeing in Asia is that a lot of these countries started reopening and talking about establishing called like these travel bubbles between two countries. But most of these have been stalled now just because there's a real fear that it's the travelers who are bringing in the COVID to the countries. So, look, like everyone, I'm looking forward to getting vaccinated and hopefully looking forward to traveling as soon as we can, hopefully by next summer. But who knows? I will say in terms of trade negotiations, it really has had an impact on trade negotiations because there's only so much you can do virtually, right? You can do, I think it's easy to kind of like the early parts of a negotiation can be done virtually because a lot of that is kind of information sharing. So I would be in a Zoom call like this. I would have given them a proposal on intellectual property protection, and I would just kind of be walking through the proposal and answering questions. Well, what did you mean by paragraph 4, subparagraph 3, when you use this word instead of that word? So that you can do virtually. And you can almost, on some of the technical issues, you can reach agreement and do that. But when it gets to the sensitive stuff, you cannot do it virtually. And frankly, why do you think Boris Johnson is on a plane right now? Precisely for that reason. And so I think it has kind of hampered the ability to make progress in the US-UK negotiations. In the WTO, they're negotiating fishery subsidies, and they've already, they weren't allowed to meet in person for a number of months, and that's kind of retarded the progress. So again, I think, the Zoom world, the virtual world, you can do, I think we're all discovering a lot more than we ever thought we could do, but, there are limits. And so, at some point we'll get back to what I would argue some kind of new normal, because I don't think we're going to be going back to where we were. I think a lot of the tools and things we're learning about working now, will hold over into the post-COVID world. I would say, though, one area that I'm very concerned about, and you probably, a number of you've read about this, is the fate of women in the workforce, during COVID. And that a lot of women, are disproportionately represented in the services sector. So either are essential workers and had to come in, but more likely were laid off if they were in the restaurant or hotel or travel realms. They've also had the responsibilities of online schooling being given to them, sometimes elder care as well. And women are leaving the workforce. And in a number of countries like Japan and others, women are, by definition, are, have been called so-called temporary workers. So as these companies kind of, reduce their employment, the temporary workers were the first to be hurt. And women were making progress in Japan and other countries in Asia in terms of becoming a more prevalent and important part of the workforce. But I think, this COVID world in the US and Asia and elsewhere, may, be a setback for progress. I think the silver lining here, though, is the whole move towards digitalization and the fact that it just provides a lot more flexibility in the workforce. And in many Asian countries, there's an expectation that you're going to be in the office, and you didn't, the notion of remote working or the notion of taking a conference call from home, all of that was kind of taboo. And I think as those practices are accepted, that can really work to the advantage of retaining women in the workforce, in Asia. So I'm watching these trends very carefully, and we're seeing them also in the US. But clearly, the COVID world has put a lot of pressures on women in the workforce, and hopefully it won't have a lasting negative impact. And hopefully the digitalization aspect, frankly, will be the enduring kind of outgrowth of this, which will work to the advantage of women.
And that is the hope we all share. Wendy, you have been incredibly gracious with your time and your forthcoming sharing of insights with all of us on behalf of Women in World Trade New England. We thank you for that. This has been a great discussion, and I hope at some point you'll join us again, maybe in person.
In person. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Good luck to everyone. Stay safe, and again, happy holidays. And Betty, thank you so much. You're a great moderator.
Thank you. It was easy with you. All right. And thank you to all in our audience. We really appreciate your being here.
Okay. Bye.